Well, here to discuss are David Scheimer, former Director for Russian Affairs at the U.S. National Security Council under President Biden, and Ivo Daalder, former U.S. Ambassador to NATO. Welcome, both of you. David, let me start with you. So what signal do you think this new policy of selling U.S. weapons to Europe to then find their way to Ukraine, what message does that send to Moscow, given how this president just months ago was so hesitant to do just that?
So I think it's a good, positive step with many details still to be worked out and follow-through still need to be had. But the core objective here should be to convince President Putin and should be to convince Russian leadership that time is not on their side in this war, that the U.S. and Western support for Ukraine will persist, and therefore that it is in Russian interest to agree to a ceasefire, which Ukraine already has agreed to. Hopefully through this new arrangement, which more details still need to be learned of, with weapons from the United States flowing to Europe, flowing to Ukraine, that will aid in shifting Russia's perceptions of the trajectory of this war and will help push them to engage in meaningful negotiations instead of just slow-walking negotiations, which is what they have been doing to this point.
Is there anything, David, from what you heard about the weapons announcements, and I think Patriot missiles, a number of defensive weapons, the president touting the strength of the U.S. Weapons industry as a whole, which are, in his words, and I think most military analysts would say, unmatched, and potentially even offensive weapons. Do you think that changes the calculus for Putin at all at this point?
So it's worth recalling, of course, that the Biden administration provided more than $60 billion worth of military aid to Ukraine. And so there is a well-plowed path to providing Ukraine with this type of support. The key question now is whether Trump will maintain that level of support, which hopefully he will through this new avenue of providing arms through Europe to Ukraine to help Ukraine defend itself. But there are questions that need to be answered. For example, will the Europeans be put at the back of the procurement line for these capabilities, which can stretch on for years, or will they be prioritized and be able to purchase capabilities on an expedited basis to get them to Ukraine more quickly, would be point one. Point two would be whether the United States will do additional drawdown from U.S. stocks for Ukraine, and then the Europeans can reimburse for those drawdown packages, which would enable the rapid flow of arms from the United States to Europe to Ukraine. And so much detail still to be worked out, but it's definitely a positive step forward in making sure that the United States continues to flow needed capabilities to Ukraine.
Yeah, and the president said in the Oval Office some of these weapons will be in Ukraine within just a matter of days. And yet, Ivo, you write that there's reason to be skeptical about this change in President Trump's positioning and policy towards Ukraine, and his skepticism about Vladimir Putin really being serious about ending this war. Why?
Well, because the record suggests that Donald Trump has, from the very beginning of this conflict, seen Ukraine as much a problem of what's happening as Russia. And in fact, until just the last few days, he always believed that he was the one who could work with Vladimir Putin to end this war. He's shifted. Clearly, the rhetoric has shifted, and now the policy is shifting, and we'll have to see how long that lasts. We now have a 50-day deadline for a ceasefire. It used to be 2 weeks. And the sanctions that he's talking about, the tariffs, are going to be put on other countries, not on the Russians. But all of that said, I'd much rather be where we are today than even last week, when he was hesitating about sending Patriots. He said, you know, we need them as well as Ukraine, and there aren't a lot there. Clearly, there is now a pathway forward to providing the weapons that only the United States has that need to be sent to Ukraine. And I hope that pathway will be quick, rapid, and fulfilled for the Ukrainians, and that the sanctions and the tariffs that are being threatened will also start to follow through. Because, as David rightly says, this war won't end until Vladimir Putin understands that he will not be able to achieve what he set out to achieve, which is the subjugation of Ukraine. And now that the United States has finally, after 6 months, come to the understanding that it is in America's interest for Putin not to succeed and for Ukraine to succeed, we may be starting along a long path, I fear longer than 50 days, towards a resolution of this conflict.
What has been quite notable is the effectiveness that the NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte has had thus far in trying to convince President Trump that this was the right direction to take in cultivating their relationship. They've known each other for years, but since the president has come back for his second term, Mark Rutte has taken on the role as NATO Secretary General. He was criticized for being a bit too sycophantic at the NATO summit, calling the president daddy, but this seems to have worked in this meeting. And I'd like to play for our viewers the basic nuts and bolts of how this policy would work as laid out by the president and the NATO Secretary General.
We made a deal today, and I'm going to have Mark speak about it, but we've made a deal today where we are going to be sending them weapons and they're going to be paying for them.
It will mean that Ukraine can get its hands on really massive numbers of military equipment, both for air defense, but also missiles, ammunition, etc., etc.
David, I'm wondering now, as you laid out earlier, what the Biden policy was in just providing these weapons to Ukraine, and knowing that at some point, given congressional approval, given the question about even procurement, how long that support could have lasted. What you make of this shift where the president seems to be really focused on his base as well and placating them by saying the U.S. isn't going to be spending any money. In fact, we'll be making money. We're going to be selling weapons to our European allies who, given where things are right now and the concerns they have about their own safety, are willing and able now to buy these weapons. Would that have been a better plan? And what do you make of it going forward?
So I think that in the context of the Biden administration, a clear judgment was made that the benefits of supporting Ukraine, including covering the cost of military aid, far outweighed the costs, given that supporting Ukraine is so fundamentally in U.S. interest, and given that the security assistance we provided to Ukraine actually enabled us to rejuvenate, fortify, and invest in our own defense industrial base. Moving forward, given the politics of where we are today, I think it makes sense for the Europeans to help pay for the provision of military aid from the United States to Ukraine, so long as, again, that provision of aid is still able to be done rapidly. Because if what we're talking about here is months or years-long delay, which would be different than what was described in the press conference, but we should be mindful of, that would be damaging and would undercut Ukraine's ability to defend itself. And so I think that if the United States is able to create a mechanism by which, through the Europeans, we're able to deliver security assistance on an expedited basis, on top of sanctions meant to increase economic pressure on Russia, particularly its energy sector, which in my view should be done in sooner than 50 days, but that's the timeline that's been laid out. And then also seeking to work with the Europeans to realize and utilize the value of the immobilized Russian sovereign assets, approximately 300 billion of them inside of Europe, to help pay for all of this, that recipe together over time, which will take, as Ivo said, longer most likely than 50 days to affect Putin's calculus, push him to the table. This will take sustained work, sustained effort, but hopefully will eventually lead to an outcome that ends this war on terms that are acceptable to the Ukrainian government.
So, Eva, what do you make of the sanctions that President Trump threatened? They're not quite where Congress is in a bipartisan bill that's making its way through both the House and the Senate with overwhelming majority approval, is that there would be sanctions, secondary sanctions leveled against countries like China and India that purchase oil and gas from Russia at some 500%. The president announcing that sanctions will be 100% and will take effect in 50 days. Were you hoping for something sooner? And what message does that send to Vladimir Putin as it does appear Russia's moving forward with their summer offensive?
Yeah, I would have hoped that we had put these sanctions in yesterday rather than tomorrow, but today would be fine as well. I think if you really want to demonstrate, as President Trump seems to want to demonstrate, that he's now had a different view both of the war and who's at fault and how to address it, which includes more support for Ukraine and more pressure on Russia, then doing that now rather than in 50 days makes a lot more sense. Why wait 50 days? What is it that he's going to get in 50 days that he's not going to get if he pushes the sanctions on now? I mean, the 100% or 500%, Both of them are big numbers. The big difference between what Trump is saying now is that he wants to do it unilaterally rather than as a mandate with Congress. And indeed, the big debate on Capitol Hill about the sanctions bill is exactly about this. Is this something that Congress mandates, or is it something that Congress says the president has the right to do whatever he wants to do? We know where Donald Trump stands. He made very clear he wants to be this at his option, both to turn on and turn off the sanctions. My sense of his record on these issues is that I have my worries that he doesn't have the staying power, that the willingness to continue to push as hard as he can. He will also have to think about how, if he's going to put sanctions on countries like India and China for buying energy resources from Russia, what is he going to do about the U.S. purchase of Russian uranium that continues until this day? The Japanese purchase of LNG gas from Russia, and the European continued support supply of gas, Russian supply of gas to Europe. All of those questions, the details of which is what will make this policy a success or not. But the most important thing happened is that we now have a different perspective from the president, who used to be on Putin's side and now clearly has decided that Putin is the problem, and therefore the pressure needs to be on him. And that is finally the right place where we all ought to be right now. Should have been there a long time ago, but I'm glad it's today.
Yeah, there are risks for leveling sanctions, secondary sanctions, we should note, against Russia. What will the retaliation be from China? What will the response be from India, who the U.S. is trying to pull more into its orbit as it's trying to separate and isolate China? And I think you make an important point that many of our viewers may not know, that the United States continues to purchase uranium even 3 years into this war from Russia at this point still. David, there also is the factor of President Putin still thinking, no matter what is thrown at him, if that's more weapons, if that's new sanctions, A, he's weathered the sanctions thus far, and B, he still believes and is being told that he is winning on the battlefield, and continues to be told that he can win this war. And it's only when Ukraine is weakened enough to come to the negotiating table that perhaps he will be earnest in wanting to bring this war to an end as well. As one Russian expert noted, he will not sacrifice his goals in Ukraine for the sake of improving relations with President Trump. So how does that factor in?
And I think President Trump is starting to understand that based on the press conference that was given today. I would say that President Putin, as a first point of order, will likely test whether President Trump is willing to sustain the posture that was described today. And so if President Putin were to offer some sort of direct face-to-face meeting over the future of the war, or were to offer some sort of half measure that's meant to indicate that he's willing to take an off-ramp without actually doing so, would that cause Trump to waver, push a 50-day deadline to 100 to 150 days, and then suddenly the war's ongoing, the attacks on Ukraine are ongoing, and the economic costs haven't been realized? That is risk number one. Point two to yours is that the Ukrainian military on its own 2 feet is a fierce fighting force. The Russian military is suffering extraordinary costs every single day. Ukraine now has a defense industrial base that is producing millions of autonomous systems every year, drones and otherwise, that can be used to counteract Russia's invading forces alongside the support that they're receiving from other countries. And so if we are to stand with the Ukrainians, provide them with the aid they need, increase the economic pressure on Russia, over time it is possible to reach a conclusion inside of Russia that, in fact, they should negotiate in good faith. But to get there, it will take work, it will take time, and it will take effort.
Yeah, Russia also stepping up its defense industrial base, but point made, and you lay it out brilliantly and quite thoroughly in a new foreign affairs piece where you talk about Ukraine's fast-moving drone industry, even outpacing that of the West. What can Washington, beyond just this war, take away from what Ukraine was able to accomplish?
So I believe very strongly that the United States has an opportunity to learn from Ukraine's innovative defense industrial base. I've had the opportunity in Ukraine to tour its drone factories, to meet with its manufacturers, and they are on the cutting edge, producing adaptable, innovative systems that can be iterated upon rapidly to overcome Russian countermeasures and produced at scale and at speed. And so we, as the United States, lack that capability currently, can learn from what Ukraine can do from their intellectual property by co-producing these types of capabilities inside of America, and we can then use those capabilities both to shore up our own national security, but also to support other partners and allies around the world were they to face similar threats in the future.
Ivo, final question to you in the minute that we have left. It is notable that the president, unlike Mark Rutte, is still not able to unequivocally say that he thinks Ukraine wants peace. We heard that from Rutte. He reiterated that. The president said, I think they do, I'm not sure, which raises your earlier concern about how committed the president is to this new policy. What does seem to have really changed is the president's comfort with NATO picking up more of the slack here and really investing in their own defense. Are you hearing any reassurances from your contacts in Europe suggesting the same?
So there's a reassurance that the president now seems to understand that Russia is a problem rather than part of the solution. That is reassuring. The worry, however, and in fact this deal that is being made where NATO countries are going to pay for equipment that the United States would sell them and then give to the Ukrainians, the worry is that that money will therefore not be available for defending and bolstering the defense of their own militaries, something that they committed to do in the Hague summit just a month ago. And so there is a trade-off here. The United States is walking away from a 3-year-long, in fact, a 10-year-long effort of helping Ukraine to defend itself, and it is no longer willing to do that. It's willing to sell weapons to others to provide to Ukraine, but is no longer willing to be part of it. That means that, by definition, there's going to be less resources in Europe to bolster European and NATO defenses than would otherwise be there, and that's a net negative. And I think people in Europe are worried about that.
Yeah, that's forcing the Europeans to step up their own weapons procurement at rapid speed as well. Ivo Daalder, David Scheimer, always good to see you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And stay with CNN.